Inverted papilloma, another favorite common topic in exam. Schneiderian papilloma it is also called as. Why it is called inverted? Because it will not grow towards the underlying stroma, rather it will be growing towards the surface, hence called inverted papilloma basically. And it need to be remembered for two reasons. Number one, it can undergo a squamous cell carcinoma transformation, and if you surgically remove it, it will undergo recurrence. For these two reasons we need to remember. And we do wide surgical excision by lateral rhinotomy is considered to be the management of choice, is what need to be remembered. Now one question definitely comes on unilateral adductor, abductor, unilateral, bilateral adductor, abductor paralysis. How will be the clinical presenting features? Where do you have stridor? Which is an emergency? Which nerve is responsible? What is the position of vocal cord? Everything you must be an encyclopedic doctor. So bilateral abductor paralysis can occur because of two major reasons. If there is any post-infection and neuritis is there, or surgical trauma like thyroidectomy is responsible. And the vocal cords will come into a median and paramedian position, and that lead to stridor and dyspnea. But what is important? How is the voice? Voice is good. In the case of until the vocal cords can undergo apposition, voice will be good. Only if they don't undergo apposition in the midline, then voice cannot. Our voice is all because of the clapping of the two vocal cords in the midline, right? So voice is still good. And we need to do tracheostomy because that stridor and respiratory problem can kill the person. And we do lateralization of the cord which is otherwise shifted towards the midline. For that we do arytenoidectomy, vocal cord lateralization, etc., as a part of the management, and cordectomy. Then what is Trotter's triad? It is the conductive deafness with the mandibular pain and immobility of the homolateral soft palate, the combination called the Trotter's triad. Now how do you decrease the chances of laterism? Vitamin C prophylaxis has a role. Banning the crop which is never accepted by the farmer community naturally. Removal of the toxin, paraboiling, education, genetic approach, socio-economic changes, all these things need to be done in order to take care of prevention of the laterism. Sputum, how do you disinfect it? This is another common question. What is the percentage of various disinfectants that we use, and how much disinfectant used? And for sputum, we use burning to destroy it. We also boil it, autoclave it. They are the three different options which are available to dispose the sputum. Then what is the weakest link in the evidence-based medicine? Evidence-based medicine has got various levels of evidence. Suppose you have given chloroquine, somebody's epilepsy came down. Can you say my chloroquine actually cured his epilepsy, so chloroquine has an anti-epileptic effect? Suppose if you say it is called personal experience. Then suddenly you met in a conference a couple of your colleagues who are also your chloroquine group. They said that even in our place, part of the country, North India, Bihar maybe, epilepsy is coming down, Kanyakumari also it is coming down. You all form a group and publish in Indian Journal of Epilepsy. Then that becomes a case study. Then after that the President of America will know about this, and he will call President of International Neurological Society and ask to conduct one study in India about chloroquine and anti-epileptic effects. Then that become a clinical trial which is randomized. Neither you nor your colleague from Bihar or Trivandrum, nobody knows, and finally results will say that you give chloroquine, epilepsy worsens, is the outcome of the study, or otherwise it has really come down. So there is a weightage of your clinical observation differs with different ways. So accordingly the level 1, 2, 3, 4 different levels are there. Level 1 means it is a randomized control trials where the evidence obtained out of that is having a stronger meaning and a value. Level 2 you have level 2-1, level 2-2 and 3. Level 2-1 means it is a well designed control trial without randomization. Level 2-2 means there is a well designed cohort or a case controlled study, and level 3 means level 2-3 means you have got multiple time series without a specific intervention, and level 3 means it is by a particular authority based on his clinical experience that he is talking. Otherwise, if you talk in terms of UK National Health, you have level A, B, C and D. I leave it as a literature review for you on what is the importance. So out of all, it is a personal experience which has got the weakest meaning in evidence based medicine is what you need to basically remember. Now let us talk about epidemiology of the HIV. There are at least some 10 questions on HIV, which is naturally expected. Ideally there must be 20 questions which are there. So last 1 week before your entrance, don't get time, at least read HIV and go to exam like a newspaper. Invariably you will answer a lot of questions, classification of antiretrovirals, etc. So there are 2.3 million children living with HIV as of 2006, and patients are very much infective during the window period is a true statement. Children are not rarely, rather they are frequently affected. The affected children will take at least 4 to 10 years before they die. It can't be as low as less than 1 year. And what is the progression towards the mortality? Towards full blown AIDS. Around 10 to 20% who are affected will die of AIDS by age of 4 years. 80 to 90% will die by age of around 9 to 10 years. So there is some amount of period between infection and the mortality to happen. And usually it takes 6 weeks to 3 months, the window period, for the HIV serology to become typically positive is what need to be remembered. So that's the reason. What are the two statements, doctor? They are infective in window period, and the 10% of HIV progress to the AIDS is also a true statement, and mother to child transmission is 25% is also a true statement out of all the statements given. Now what is the concentration of HIV? It is highest in blood, then semen, vaginal fluids, then comes the breast milk, transmissible form of the HIV. Then we talk about hepatitis. Hepatitis A in adult is more severe or children is more severe? Paradoxically, it is a milder illness in case of pediatric population. Hepatitis A is what need to be basically remembered. There is a 0% carrier state, no carrier state at all, and it won't transform into HCC, and there is no vertical transmission with regard to the hepatitis A is what need to be remembered. Then how do you define primary and secondary amenorrhea? It is the failure of menses to occur by 16 years in the presence of a normal growth and normal secondary sexual characteristics. Failure of menses at age 16 is considered the definition of the primary amenorrhea. When do you call oligoamenorrhea? If it extends beyond 35 days. And absence of menses for 6 months is called amenorrhea basically. So these are all the definitions about it. Now you have got the parent to child transmission prevention centers called PPTCT. So what are we giving there? It is single dose nevirapine is the one which is being given. Though it has got a risk of promoting the resistance, but still we can afford to give only the single dose of nevirapine at the time of the labor, and newborn babies also get a single dose of nevirapine immediately after the birth so as to prevent the transmission. That is what we basically give. Then HIV positive near the term, what is the advice to prevent transmission? Can you say that by doing cesarean I will decrease the incidence of HIV vertical transmission? Cesarean itself is a procedure that spills a lot of blood. That's the reason, though it has got a lesser chances than vaginal delivery for promoting vertical transmission, still it is attendant with the risk. So I am not very sure whether I only leave a little literature support to you on what the authorities guidelines about Cochrane review guidelines about the right type of delivery in HIV. Then let's go to the next question. Once more, this is another question. Breastfeeding HIV positive mother. Do you want to give exclusive breastfeeding just like you promote it in the normal non-HIV mothers, or do you want to give top feed, totally breastfeeding ban, or a combination? Combination definitely is a wrong thing. There is no role for combination of top plus breast. Either breast or no breast we should decide basically. So the recommendations what they say is, in third world countries still the breastfeeding is advised, though it carries a 40% risk of promoting the transmission of HIV virus, because malnutrition, intestinal infections, diarrhea, all this become more if it is a top feed instead of a breastfeed. So that's the reason the breastfeed is the one which is still promoted. Exclusive breastfeeding is the one which is being promoted even if the mother is HIV positive in the third world countries and the less advanced countries. Now let's go to the next question. To manage hirsutism in PCOD, what do we basically give? We give oral contraceptives, spironolactone, flutamide and eflornithine. All these are the various medications to manage which will reduce the androgen content and decrease the chances of hirsutism. In gonorrhea, discharge, febrile illness, hematuria, vulvovaginitis and asymptomatic presentation, any of them can be the presenting features which you can very much see in gonorrhea clinical presentation. Now when do you call high risk pregnancy? Elderly primey, short statured primey. Short statured means less than 140 centimeters, elderly means more than 30 years, and a prolonged pregnancy and history of previous cesarean, anemia, twins, hydramnios, they are all considered to be the risk factor. And is the weight is a part of high risk pregnancies? At least in this list it is not there. So eliminating that, previous LSCS and twin pregnancies out of the options given are very much considered to be the risk factors in a high risk pregnancy. Wet mount, not only for trichomonas, we also use it for bacterial vaginosis and also for identifying the yeast, that is in the candida also we basically use it. Then we look forward for the clue cells in the case of the bacterial vaginosis. So there are the three important infections. To support the diagnosis of the syphilis, how will be the ulcer? How will be the lymph node? Lymphadenopathy, which is painful, painless, indurated, non-indurated, everything you must be very sure. Generally it is within 3 weeks of the contact they will be developing, and the primary chancre is solitary red papule that rapidly forms a painless non-bleeding ulcer is what need to be remembered. And if you look at the edge or the base of the ulcer, it has got a cartilaginous button-like consistency on palpation, and the secretions are highly infectious because they contain a lot of Treponema pallidum organisms. There is a reason history of exposure, induration of the base, and the painless inguinal lymphadenopathy and Treponema in the secretions, they are all considered to be the true statements is what need to be remembered. Now to decrease the bleeding of myomectomy, what do you want to do? Shrink the size of the myoma. For that you use all these things, prevent anemia, give preoperative ossipils, ligation of pedicle, GnRH analogs, and also local intramyomatous injection of a vasoconstrictive agent like vasopressin also has got a hemostatic effect and decrease the chance of the bleeding is what need to be remembered. 35-year-old completed family, ovarian cyst of 7 centimeters discovered. Favorite question of the examiner. Ovarian cysts are a normal finding. Cyst need not be malignancy. So it is a size criteria which will make us to decide whether to really intervene or not. So that is the reason, doctor, we need to know that normally follicle size is around 1.5 to 2.5 centimeters. And nearly all premenopausal women and around 14.8% of postmenopausal women will show the presence of cysts. And in the case of a postmenopausal woman, a persistent cyst which is smaller than 5 centimeters in dimension, in the presence of a normal CA125, it can be monitored without much of intervention. If it is postmenopausal, it is 5 centimeters. If it is premenopausal women who is asymptomatic otherwise, instantly found to have cysts, 8 centimeters is the criteria. Provided, once more, the CA125 must be normal, but CA125 nothing was mentioned in the case. Is it mentioned in the case history? No. So there is a reason nothing need to be done, observation is more than sufficient. This is how the cyst can appear, the theca lutein cyst can very much appear, and we must differentiate, we need to differentiate between simple and a complex cyst. Now a multiparous woman with LSCS now presenting with cyclical hematuria. What is that syndrome called as? Yusuf syndrome. Heard of that? So there can be development of a vesicouterine fistula without vaginal leak, cyclical hematuria and amenorrhea. The combination which can develop post caesarean, which is basically called Yusuf syndrome, is what need to be remembered. That's the reason it should be a vesicouterine fistula which presents with a cyclical hematuria. What are the risk factors for the carcinoma of the cervix? Human papilloma, definitely. Multiple partners, and early sexual activity with an early marriage is also a risk factor. It is the multiple deliveries, not nulliparous, is a risk factor, and HIV positivity. And they found that if there is a circumcision in the male partner, the incidence of their female partner's carcinoma cervix will decrease, because it is found that circumcision decreases the chances of HPV, homing of the HPV. But later on some studies refuted that observation, but still we can consider that as a valid observation. So it is uncommon in with the circumcision in the male partner. Now for the ectopic pregnancy we use the methotrexate, is very much a true statement. For the postpartum hemorrhage we do internal iliac ligation, uterine tamponade, and also B-Lynch suture is another option which is available. Beta HCG we use in order to monitor any gestational trophoblastic tumor, the response of it to the treatment and the chance of recurrence, everything monitored by beta HCG. Choriocarcinoma, hydatidiform mole, and even ectopic pregnancy also, beta HCG helps for you in diagnosis. How? Suppose if the beta HCG value is around 1500 international units per ml, and still you are unable to see a visible fetus, fetal pole, that means there is a ectopic pregnancy. So it is useful even in the monitoring of that. The magnesium sulfate can lead to anuria, it can lead to decreased mentation with sedation, and also it has got a hypotensive effect. That's the reason, especially if you give rapid mag sulfate, it can lead to hypotension and asystole as the complications. In the preterm labor we use certain tocolytic agents. Dexamethasone is not used for tocolysis, it is only to improve the fetal lung maturity we give in a preterm labor. So other than dexamethasone here, ritodrine, mag sulfate, beta blocker, any of them can, we don't use, propranolol is not the, should be the answer, right? But dexamethasone also is not a tocolytic agent. Then indomethacin is used, mag sulfate is used, terbutaline like beta mimetic is used, ritodrine is also used, and these are all the, you also need to know the adverse effect profile of them. The lady recovered from severe PPH and failure of lactation is there. What is the syndrome? Sheehan syndrome. Sheehan's, will it affect only anterior or even posterior pituitary also? If it affects posterior pituitary, then option A becomes, B becomes a true statement. Why? Posterior pituitary produces ADH, and absence of ADH lead to increased water excretion. Only rarely it lead to a pan-hypopituitarism, but generally it is the anterior pituitary which become affected is what you need to basically remember. So that's the reason still I consider option B as a reasonable answer. And I try to search whether GnRH values will shoot, because normally GnRH will stimulate TSH, LH, FSH and all. And because pituitary is gone, LH, FSH is being not there, reflexly GnRH should shoot ideally. But I could not get any literature support to support option D, but still I consider option B as a possibility, considering that rare posterior pituitary being necrotized in the case of the Sheehan's. Estrone estradiol, estrogen, they are all basically called as natural steroids is what need to be remembered. Now what happens in polycystic ovarian disease? There is a lot of estrogen and only thing is post-ovulatory progesterone which is expected is not available. So what happens in case of PCOD, doctor? LH become tonically elevated, FSH is within the reference range or low, LH to FSH ratio become greater than 3 and the exaggerated LH to GnRH response is what you basically see in case of PCOD. How will be the free testosterone levels and dehydroepiandrosterone sulfate levels in PCOD? Either they are normal or slightly elevated. So that is the reason LH increased, FSH normal to low and testosterone being increased, these two become the potential correct options about PCOD. Then the next important thing is the cyclical progesterone which is expected post ovulation is not produced here. That is the main problem, and this absence of post ovulatory progesterone is the one which will promote the increased LH production reflexly, hence LH become excessive in these individuals. So high LH, normal to low FSH, increased LH FSH ratio with normal to slightly increased testosterone with a low progesterone. This is the combination what you call it as PCOD. If there is asymptomatic UTI in pregnancy, still you treat it. Why? Because the fetal growth retardation etc. are thought to be due to this bacteria, asymptomatic bacteria. So inevitably in the third trimester send the woman to get a culture, urine culture, and if it is showing bacteria, then though she is not having any dysuria or any symptomatic presentation, still you treat it is considered to be the rule. And if you do not treat it, one of the important complication is development of perinephric cellulitis, septicemic shock, renal dysfunction, pyelonephritis etc. Now what drugs are safe to treat the UTI in pregnancy? You can use amoxicillin, nitrofurantoin, trimethoprim, sulfamethoxazole and cephalosporin derivatives like cephalexin, zolin and cefibutin, cefuroxime, ceftriaxone, any of them are very much the options available. Somebody presented to you with a unilateral hydronephrosis and you have evaluated the ureteropelvic junction. Generally fibrosis of ureteropelvic junction congenitally is the underlying cause of the development of hydronephrosis in the significant population. So if there is a unilateral hydronephrosis but ureteropelvic junction is normal, serially you can follow them. There is no need for an active intervention that need to be done, basically is what need to be remembered. Now but most important, before you leave the patient like that, you should evaluate PUJ junction and be very sure that most common cause PUJ obstruction is not there, then leave the patient who is presenting with a unilateral hydronephrosis is what need to be remembered. Any live attenuated vaccine is contraindicated, hence OPV, MMR you should not give, whereas rabies, influenza, hepatitis are all basically kill vaccines, as all of you know. Now what are the American Heart Association guidelines to the CPR? I could not get the options, so I leave the literature on what are the recent developments in the ACR guidelines. Now in the newborn, certain things are normal. Erythema toxicum, Mongolian spots, harlequin changes, then acne neonatarum and a transient neonatal pustular melanosis, they are all considered to be the normal findings is what need to be remembered. Out of all the locations, it is the lumbosacral area where you have the blue color caused by the melanocytes. In the case of the Mongolian spots, the most common location is lumbosacral. 2-week infant, noisy breathing, no chest distractions, accepting feed normally, no fever, X-ray is clear. What is your diagnosis? Laryngomalacia. So only reassure. Is there any role for saline drops? No. Where will you use saline drops? If a baby is not feeding well, breastfeeding well, what is one of the two common causes? as a pediatric house surgeon you must have come across quite frequently. Mother is habituating. She is working in a top multinational company and giving a breastfeed is a bigger challenge than writing a Oracle program. So that's the reason some time of homing between the baby and the mother is very much required, first 1 week or so. Then the second cause is if there is any nasal obstruction in the baby, he can't take breastfeed well. See the nostrils, if something is obstructing, put nasal drop instillation, saline drops, then if it relieves the baby can feed very well. So that the two important causes. So no need for saline drops here. Laryngomalacia naturally will resolve. 4 to 6 weeks is the common age of onset and it takes 2 years. The only treatment is time. Time should give the healing effect is what need to be remembered. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, we use imipramine, methylphenidate, dextroamphetamine, all these drugs, but out of all this, imipramine is the least preferred drug because of its tricyclic antidepressant. It being a tricyclic antidepressant, it has got a lot of dirty side effects. Hence we generally prefer either dextroamphetamine or methylphenidate out of the options which are available. Clonidine and guanifacine were also used. Modafinil also is used as one of the options. Most important is behavioral parent training BPT, behavioral classroom management BCM are considered important interventions. Then after the grand mal epilepsy, what will happen? Naturally too much of muscular activity should lead to the movement of the intracellular ions into an extracellular compartment should be responsible. Plasma prolactin levels are also elevated if it is a true seizure activity. Now let's go to the next question. In Hirschsprung's disease, we do the barium enema which is diagnostic and it is generally the aganglionic segment which is narrowed and normally innervated segment is dilated and barium enema can be able to depict it quite clearly. But the definitive diagnosis means you need to do a transmural rectal biopsy which is considered to be the investigation of choice. Preterm babies are highly vulnerable to necrotizing enterocolitis and gram-negative bacteremia as all of you know very well. Now why breastfeed is important? It contains protective immunoglobulin, nutritious, sweet, improves maturation of the baby's immune system, etc., etc. Surfactant is type 2 pneumocytes and it is deficient in preterm. Now the developmental milestone without which there is no question paper at all. So the baby is able to move the hand object from one hand to the other hand. So what is the age group that you are thinking of, doctor? We think of if it is 7 months, he can sit without support, imitate sounds, and if it is 8 months, he can sit without support and pass object from one hand to the other. That means he is a 8 months old baby. So 8 months old baby can sit without support, he can say mama and dada. Then so sit without support is true, not stand without support yet, say mama and dada, he can't walk without support, and babbling is before saying mama and dada. So naturally he can also babble, but I mean already he crossed the babbling stage. Then large widened anterior fontanelle, where do you have? Narrowed anterior fontanelle, where do you have? So basically it is achondroplasia, congenital hypothyroidism, Down syndrome, increased intracranial pressure, familial macrocephaly, rickets, not scurvy, which will be responsible for a widened anterior fontanelle. Then craniosynostosis, where there is a premature closure of fontanelle, where do you see? Once more hyperthyroidism, not hypo. Rickets become a cause for both of them, a widened and also a craniosynostosis, any of them can happen. Hypophosphatemia, hyperparathyroidism can be responsible for a craniosynostosis. Then what will happen with vitamin C deficiency? Pseudoparalysis, all of you know, gum bleeding will occur. Then where do you see Sieberschen and frontal bossing? Sieberschen is what you see in the case of the tertiary syphilis, where there is a deformation of the tibia, and frontal bossing will be seen if there is any extramedullary hematopoiesis like the thalassemia major or sickle cell anemia is what need to be remembered. Wilms tumor versus neuroblastoma. It's a very, very common differential diagnosis radiology when you are doing post graduation. Now let us go to the neuroblastoma versus Wilms tumor. What are the differences? Predominantly age group, predominantly before age of 5 is what you see Wilms, and the mean age is 3 years, but neuroblastoma, the greater than 50% are seen before 2 years. Risk factors are different between the two, like Beckwith-Wiedemann, aniridia, GU abnormalities, chromosome 11, they are all associated with the Wilms. And Hirschsprung's and chromosome 1 and von Recklinghausen, fetal Hydantoin syndrome, they are all associated with neuroblastoma. Then you have an abdominal mass that crosses the midline is the feature in the case of Wilms, frequently asked question. Whereas in neuroblastoma, abdominal mass will not cross the midline, is a differentiating feature. Then if you look at hematuria, it's more likely to be a feature of Wilms, because Wilms, where does it arise from? From the collecting ducts of the kidney. So that's the reason, I mean it is basically a nephroblastoma. So that is the reason hematuria is a feature, whereas neuroblastoma originating from suprarenal, adrenal, hematuria is a rare feature, is what need to be remembered. Then if you look at Wilms tumor, there is something called as a claw sign, where the concavity of the renal contour with the renal parenchyma, there is a cupping of it with the tumor. And if you look at the neuroblastoma, neuroblastoma is not arising from kidney, it is from suprarenal. So it will displace the kidney. Whereas the Wilms tumor, which is nephroblastoma, it arises from kidney, hence it will engulf the kidney. So that is the difference between neuroblastoma versus Wilms. Then if you look at calcifications, they are more often a feature in the case of neuroblastoma and only around 15% in the case of the Wilms tumor. And if you look at the IVC and aorta, the neuroblastoma, which is suprarenal, will cause the encasement of them, whereas the Wilms tumor will cause the displacement of the vessels, which is the fundamental difference. So neuroblastoma displaces kidney but encases vessels, whereas Wilms will engulf the kidney but displaces the vessels. So these are the fundamental differences. And Wilms will be hypervascular, heterogeneous, solid, calcification only less than 20%, and there can be intraspinal extension with the metastasis going to the bone, and it can be associated with the genitourinary malformations like Wager and Dennis-Dance syndrome, etc. And it can be associated with the Beckwith-Wiedemann, etc., etc. So that's the reason, doctor, to summarize the question given in the PGI, Wilms is also called nephroblastoma, it's a true statement, and intracranial metastases are seen very much in the case of Wilms. Neuroblastoma is the one which will push the kidney, whereas nephroblastoma engulf the kidney with a claw sign. And speckle calcifications is a feature but not a predominant feature of Wilms, it is more often a feature of neuroblastoma. And invasion of the renal vein is a feature of the Wilms tumor, very much will cause the displacement of vessels, whereas encasement of vessels is a feature of neuroblastoma. So that is in summary. Now the next question was once more on Wilms tumor. What are the associations? Already we discussed aniridia, genitourinary problems, and the hemihypertrophy, they are all the part of the Wilms tumor very much. Then choanal atresia is associated with what are the other abnormalities? What is that syndrome called as, where choanal atresia is a part of it with cardiovascular problem? CHART syndrome it is called as. C for coloboma, H for heart anomalies, choanal atresia, retardation of the growth and development and genital and ear anomalies, the combination called as the CHARGE syndrome. This is a typical ear in the case of a CHARGE syndrome, the ear abnormality. Then what is a LBW? What do you mean by short for gestational age? What do you mean by preterm? Everything is not one and same, there is a difference between them. So low birth weight means less than 2500 grams. It is weight to weight talking, no statistics or standard deviations or anything. Low birth weight means low birth weight. Big rank means big rank in entrance. There can't be, no, maybe I fall into the other 10% of the last part of the standard deviation. We can't say, right? So very low birth weight means less than 1500, extremely low birth weight means less than 1000 grams is what need to be remembered. Term or preterm, once more is a very standard value is there. There is no standard deviation statistics involved. Born after 37 is term and less than 37 is basically called preterm, more than 40 is called postterm. Whereas small for gestational age is basically a statistical comparison. If the neonate's weight is less than 10th percentile for that given gestational age, then it is called as small for gestational age. It's not an absolute value basically. And if it is greater than 90th percentage of the weight for that given gestational age, then it is called as large for gestational age. Then how about IUGR? How do you define it? It is once more statistics. IUGR is neonates whose growth is not at the 10th percentile of their gestational age in utero is basically called as the IUGR. Basically IUGR and SGA is before birth and after birth comparisons from statistical perspective. Now let's go to the next question. Pirie-Robinson sequence or syndrome, whatever, what is the combination you find? You have a cleft soft palate, high arched palate and retrognathism, natal teeth, recurrent ear infections, etc., which are the part of the Pirie-Robinson syndrome.